All right, it is the top of the hour, but we'll give another minute or two to make sure everybody can possibly get into Meet Echo, for those unfamiliar with using it. So we'll give another minute or two and then we'll get started. Good day, Anthony. I do not hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to meet you.
You too. We will... Let's go ahead and get started. This is likely going to be a small group, but it's the core set of people are here. I'm not sure where Claire went. She was here earlier, but maybe she'll be back in a bit. This is the Secure Asset Transfer Protocol Working Group Interim Meeting. As a reminder, all of these meetings are recorded and later published to YouTube. That also includes anything in the chat, by the way. We'll start with the note well, as we always do. This is a sort of reminder that about IETF policies on both how patents work within the IETF and code of conduct. I'm not a lawyer, so you should go read the note well. There's good links on the IETF if you're going to contribute and have knowledge of what's happening in your country that may be related to the SATP topic. You should definitely be aware how your contributions apply. There's a bunch of information about the working group. We have a data tracker page about it, and our purpose is really to develop a protocol to transfer digital assets between two different networks. I think most people know that. There's a couple of drafts that exist already to date, and sorry about my notifications that are going off. I'll have to quit that chat application. There's a bunch of people chatting from a completely different group. So the agenda today, introductions and announcements, that's sort of us at the moment. And I would really love a note taker. I posted a note link to the chat room if anybody is willing to take notes. As I said earlier, I threw my back out and I'm trying not to do too much typing because it doesn't really please it. And so, notes just really need to be sort of decisions made and things like that. We don't need anything terribly verbose, word for word or anything like that. If you are interested and willing to be a note taker, please do speak up. If you're a really active participant, you're probably not the right person to take notes, but if you're going to participate in the discussions, but somebody else would be helpful. We'll talk about the architecture document first, and then we'll talk about the SATP core document. They're obviously related. And then, of course, if there's time, we often have other discussion topics under any other business, although we have no pre-listed for today. A couple of quick announcements. We have a new area director. We thank Paul for his time, but Ori Steele is the new area director as things have reshuffled in the ASG. Claire and I had a good chat with him a couple of weeks ago, and he's very interested in this work, so that's a good thing. Couple of quick reminders. I know not everybody is super familiar with the IETF, but the way the IETF process happens, all discussions and decisions really needs to be made on the mailing list or in an official public venue. That actually includes GitHub tickets and things like that, or in official meetings and interims. So please don't have side discussions that are going to be decision-making related things. So they really do need to be officially announced interim meetings. Actually, Claire and I got reprimanded for actually scheduling this one too fast. We really need to post an agenda 2 weeks in advance of meetings in the first place. Although, since there was already a discussion that was going to happen, he let it slide this time. But a quick reminder about our scope. In scope is the asset network to network transfer. In other words, things being transferred between two networks. Out of scope is, how a network has to deal with guaranteeing that they have the ability to, to actually do that transaction. And I think it's well recognized that that is it can be a challenge not to think about the whole problem when you need to make sure that a network can be legally obligated to be able to hold on to, lock, and then transfer an asset. But the charter of this working group specifically excludes that because there was nervousness when the working group was formed that we were biting off more than we could chew, and they should really be independent things. And so legal agreements, sort of help protect that. Also in scope, though, are requirements for what an asset network must have, right? And you obviously need to be able to tell the gateway and the other in a particular network that, hey, you have to have the ability to ensure that you can complete this transaction. And whether that's locking or semantics related to that, we just can't dictate how that happens. That might be future work. And then finally, our next SATP meeting will be at IETF 120. I did submit a request for it earlier today, so we should get a time slot at IETF 120. If you're not going to attend physically, that is fine. There is a remote attendance as well. We know that a number of people will be there physically, so I look forward to it. And then we have a diagram that we've thrown up a lot in the past about scope. And it really just shows that the yellow box in the middle is what we're talking about. Everything else is potential future scope, but for the time being, only between sort of these two gateways that bound the network is within scope. With that, does anybody have questions before we get started and dive into architecture-related discussions?
Just a quick one. Just to clarify, hi, for those that don't know me, I'm the co-chair. When we say between networks, the scope for the first draft is omnidirectional, so from network A to network B. Also, Wes, I don't know if you were sharing slides, but I didn't see anything. I don't know if anyone else had that same issue.
I was just going to say I can't see the slide.
What? Oh, that's weird because it shows on my screen that I'm sharing it.
It shows, for me, it just says the screen shows being started.
Drat. Okay, let me try again, and I apologize because that would have been a much more understandable conversation had you actually seen my slides.
I did wonder, and it wasn't until you said in the yellow box that I thought, there we go, here we go, the scope.
That's the exact same thing I did before. So anyway, we love Meet Echo. It's a wonderful tool. So really quickly, make sure you understand the note well. That was the critical thing. There's a lot of working group information. You guys already know all that. There's the agenda we have for the day, including the note link, which is at the bottom. These reminders I read over in person, and then that is the diagram that I was just talking about. So thank you and apologies to everybody. And thank you for Claire. You clarified that, remember that this is also a unidirectional transfer with the goal of eventually, being able to do swapping or bidirectional transfers, but that is out of scope for sort of version 1. Thank you, Claire.
No worries. And just to echo really what you're seeing on screen, for those of you that are new, that this does include legacy systems. This is not blockchain and cannot just be for blockchains. This must be agnostic to the underlying network.
Thank you. That is also very true. This is why we use asset network a lot. There is definitely people that would prefer it to be generic, and more importantly, there's a lot of antagonistic people against the word blockchain that we are trying to make it work for many different types of systems, both public and private ledgers as well. So. Anything else? Is anybody willing to help take notes? I will do what I can.
I feel like we should nominate someone, really.
What, Claire? You kind of broke up.
No,
All right, so why don't we turn it over to Thomas to capture. And by the way, we greatly appreciate all of the discussion that's happened on the mailing list. It's been a very active discussion, so I greatly appreciate it. But Thomas, do you want to give us sort of the status of where things are? I believe that you have said that you believe the architecture document is ready for a last call, correct?
Yes. So you guys need to see my my face with hay fever, or you just
No, it's fine, and you don't need to see me with my bad back either. Yeah, you're really quiet though. Are you able to turn your volume up at all?
Let me do that. Is this better? This is that better?
That's a little bit better. Yes, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, this is Firefox for you, but okay. Yeah, so architecture, I think this has been waiting a long time, and I think the one big one was David with the suggestions of adding more text about the threat analysis, and there's only so much that we could put in the Appendix A. But it could be that a future document, assuming there are people interested, a future work item could be a threat analysis document on the protocol, so that implementers are wary and can know that some aspects of it are open to possible attacks, such as the ones discussed in the appendix, such as the gateway 2, pretending message is lost and then exhausting gateway 1, right? So that's kind of the first topic. The second, probably last issue, is Anthony brought up, interestingly, this topic of ownership, and I just posted this morning some wording. This is section 3.3. There was an assumption there where we said that the gateway technically owns the asset while it is handling it. And I was thinking maybe a softer term could be control, because I'm thinking beyond what, our community, other communities may not like the term owned, right? Because own is not a engineering mechanical sort of term. It's more of a legal term. And so control might be a softer word, but the intent is clear that the gateway owner is legally and financially liable if something goes wrong during the transit. And this also follows from our probably unstated assumption that gateways are not anonymous machines running out there. There is somebody that is in charge of it and kind of acts as a service provider. And so I think in some other sections of the document, you might hear the word, gateway service provider, gateway provider, or gateway as a service. All points to the fact that there is some human being or some company or business that is legally on the hook, financially on the hook during the controlling of the asset in transfers throughout the duration.
Do you want me to chip in there, Thomas?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, my mic is open.
So yeah, I can understand that that there may be circumstances in which the gateway operator has that control and liability, but there are other circumstances in which the gateway is just a technical construct that could very well, could very well pass assertions about the state of the asset during the transfer. So to the extent that let's take an example. If Citibank, for example, has issued a token and it says, yes, we've locked the asset, passing an assertion back that says, yes, Citibank has locked the asset, may in certain circumstances be sufficient for the transfer to take place. In other words, the other side may well say, okay, fine, I'm happy then to mint the asset on the other side because I have a signed assertion from Citibank that the asset is locked and can't be moved. In other circumstances, that's not going to be enough. So you may have to have a third party or you may have to have a more certain outcome. So you could say, for example, the asset's been transferred to this escrow account, in effect, which is what we're saying the gateway could act as. But I can't see the need for the gateway to be for it to have to be the gateway operator, because the gateway operator is just another person entity, and the gateway is asserting, well, let's say the gateway operator is FIS, for example. Okay, the gateway is asserting, oh, FIS is now holding this asset. How is that functionally different from the gateway asserting, well, Bank of New York is holding this asset now? I mean, to me, it seems like the gateway should be a technical construct which passes assertions rather than being a participant in the transaction. The gateway operator could choose to be a participant in the transaction, but making it a part of the protocol kind of limits options at this point, I think.
So let me try and get some clarification on this discussion, so we can pick sort of one topic to dwell in on in particular. I think that the primary topic that Thomas was bringing up was about what the right terminology should be that we should stick to in the documents. And there's very good points about what entities are, sort of what roles they play. And I'm wondering, are there two topics here we want to discuss, with the first one being the terminology of own versus control versus some other terminology. I think that with my technical non-chair hat on, right, the word own does seem like a very weird, verb to be using with the gateway in particular. But when we are discussing the protocol being developed between the two gateways, what is the right term to be using when talking about, the asset and how that is in being held, essentially?
I would use assert.
Well, assert what, though, right? Assert, you can't say I assert the asset.
No,
you're asserting
you say that the gateway passes an assertion that the asset is disabled. That means that the assertion has an identity, like a certificate and a signed assertion, that the other party can evaluate, basically, as to whether they complete their side of the transaction. If that assertion came from Citibank, maybe. If it came from, Second Swamp Bank of Alabama, maybe not. So I don't mean to cast
I think that's
people from Alabama.
That's what we have in the flows, right? These are a set of signed assertions from a thing called a gateway. Now, the endpoints, so if you look into the core, we use the word endpoint in a lot of IETF specs, like in OAuth 2.0, it's always, the authorization endpoint, token validation endpoint. And so the endpoint is the thing that communicates with its peer endpoint. And so in your example, Anthony, if in fact the assertion is being produced by some other third party like an escrow company, well, maybe in fact that the yellow flow there, it is actually running between an escrow entity with gateway G2, and so that's the focus. Is we need to complete a message assertion flow set of assertions so that both sides are happy, that both sides have done what they promised to do according to the SATP core protocol, and they're liable if they lie, right? And so I think the word gateway is just a generic way for engineers to say this is the endpoint, right? And so we could say sender endpoint, receiver endpoint. That would create other questions. Well, like, who's the sender? Is it Chase Bank? Is it some other institution, right? The point is there's always going to be a sending endpoint and a receiving endpoint, and vice versa in the peer peer messaging, the protocol.
I agree that. Then the question would arise: does you don't want to have, or at least I wouldn't think you'd want to have, a gateway per sender and a different gateway per receiver. So these are shared entities. So behind gateway 1, you could have lots of actors. So that's why I'm trying to really think about the separation between the gateway and the party that is participating in the transaction. So on a public blockchain, you're going to have hundreds of thousands of different actors, and not each of them is going to have a gateway. So the gateway has to be a shared resource that's not specific to any one particular actor on that in the network that's behind.
Yeah, that's definitely supportable. So for example, I've said multiple times, I mean, the gateways could just be a thin shim, right? Just a front-facing, to be perfectly blunt, web server, right? A balancer, load balancer, and behind the thin shim gateway could be real actors, real machines, right? I think the point is that somebody has to sign it in such a way that the other side, G2, and whoever is behind the thin shim at G2 is accepting the signatures, number one. And number two, the session has to remain intact from commencement to the end, right? So you can't switch signatures, signees, midway, right? So if there's an actor behind G1, actor A1, and there's actor A5 behind G2, well, if the session commences with the signatures from A1 and A5, then it has to commence all the way to the end. Right? You can't break the flow midway and switch signees, because it'll break atomicity and all the ACID guarantees.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the way that in our software, I mean, we're doing this sort of thing within our software, and we're trying to bring it to be compliant with SATP. That's my kind of approach. The way we're doing that within our software is with each message to send a signature, what's a hash, signature over the hash plus a certificate, and we're using X509 certificates. So what happens when gateway 2 or the actor behind gateway 2 receives this? They have to trust the certificate authority of the certificate. So basically, it implies that you have a PKI system per transaction, if you like, that the sender and the receiver both trust. If they don't, then then the transaction shouldn't go ahead. But I know this is kind of out of scope, but that's how I would, see an assertion being sent. It's something is said by this party who is identified in this way. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think we're on the same page.
Yeah,
I think we talk about X509s all the time, but that's out of scope, Anthony.
I know.
And also, this other question, also out of scope, but worth mentioning, is the SSL connection being set up between the endpoints is going to use some kind of X509, right? Is that the same X509 used to sign assertion, or should it not be, right? So these are interesting questions that we want to do in the future, right? For this after we do,
Yeah,
rechartering
I mean,
if we're allowed. Good point.
Before we move on, Rama's got his hand up and has for a while. So Rama, thank you for your patience.
Oh, thanks, Claire. Yeah, I was just going to ask, go back to the terminology. When the question about assertions are, I think, as Thomas said, we can revisit them in the future. We can. I think there's nothing preventing us from piggybacking assertions on top of the existing SATP messages. But anyway, that was not my main comment. Going back to terminology about control of assets, I just wonder if we can soften the term a bit, because say something to the effect of that control not being absolute. I think that's maybe what's bothering Anthony. So I think the gateway clearly needs to have control over the process of transfer of a given asset to a designated gateway. I think we cannot avoid that, as we discussed in the mailing list. But maybe you can say something like the gateway has limited control rather than an open-ended control of the form, which will allow, say, G1 to just hand over the asset to G3, for example.
So I think that one of the troubles scope-wise is, so a couple of things. One, I think, Thomas, the TLS connection between the two gateways very much is in scope, right? That is a connection set up for how to bring this protocol into a usable form between two gateways. But the fundamental assumptions that we are talking about are that the gateways are in control of an asset in some way. So I don't know the right terminology, and you guys are welcome to pick whatever term you want. Whether and to some extent, the assertions that need to be made to show that that gateway is in control, maybe in the legal aspects, which are sort of in the gray dotted spaces up above. One of the things we have stated since the creation of this working group is that, at least in the beginning, we expect that there is a legal relationship between the two networks, so that there is that trust built in between the two networks that, hey, I trust this other network to properly implement a gateway in such a way that these transactions are not going to fail. And if they do, then I have a legal, contract allowing me to go after them in a legal sense of the word, or something like that. What we have never targeted with, at least in the initial version of this, is to have network gateway discovery for unknown asset networks, where you want to just transfer something to somebody that you have no idea what they are, right? That is a trust relationship, which is not anywhere near scope at the moment. So the assertions and other things that are being talked about, to a large extent, have to exist to some extent already, right? So like the notion of trusting a CA to produce a signature mechanism like an X509 cert or whatever it might be, in order to make signed messages that allow the whole SAT protocol to properly conduct the transaction, is sort of equivalent to, once these two particular entities and networks agreed with each other that they're willing to transfer stuff between them, and that they have a legal framework behind it, then you add the root CA to the list of trusted, accepted, entities. That's sort of how I see it at a technical level. But the scope becomes interesting there, because we are making some base assumptions, and I've argued since the beginning we should make sure that those are well documented in the architecture. Anthony, go ahead.
I think the protocol between the gateways would, I mean, something like mutual TLS would be ideal for this, because mutual TLS is already a very well used standard. It does require certificates and keys within the gateway, but that trust is just about the passing of messages. So in other words, I know both gateways know that they are connecting to an identifiable server at the other end, and then that takes care of the encryption between the two. And where it I find it hard is the gateway itself. Let's say behind the gateway you have a very big bank, like let's take Citibank again, and the gateway says this asset has been locked by Citibank, and then Citibank defaults. Who would you sue? The gateway operator? I mean, the gateway operator is to some extent a message passing. It's like SMTP. I mean, if I send a libelous message over email, I don't go and look for the SMTP service operator and say, you're liable for this slur. I mean, I go to the actual sender, and the SMTP operator is not responsible for the content of the messages. It's responsible. However, if the SMTP operator, chose to forward my message to some random third person or to somebody who could damage me, then I would sue the SMTP operator, because their role is to accurately convey the message to the other SMTP server that I've nominated in my message. And that's what they're liable for. They're not liable for the content of the message or for the, and I think it should be the same in SATP.
Yeah.
That's my view.
Thomas, I think.
Go ahead. I was going to say, so Anthony's, I think in a case like Chase, there are two things. So either Chase runs its own gateway service, so Chase Bank owns the gateway, so they're liable. Or if Chase is outsourcing the gateway running to a provider, then there is a contract. There should be a contract between the provider and Chase saying that that any sort of mistakes caused by Chase, transfers liability to the provider is going to turn around and claim back to Chase, right? So there needs to be a contract between whoever's using the gateway provider. Okay, so it's not just, and also the SMTP may not be the best parallel, Anthony, because this is not just message passing in the sense of ISO 220. This is actually causing changes on the state of the network, right? This burn and mint sort of model. And it's different from correspondent banking, right? And it gets more complicated because the other side may not be a bank, right? The other side could be a private blockchain or a public blockchain, right? So we're always thinking that the other side is not, something traditional like a bank, because we know how to deal with banks. Plenty of contracts, around. There's plenty of banking consortiums that actually share, legal frameworks and so on. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Claire.
I have a question, and please forgive me as chair. I should know the answer to this. Can someone remind me where we got to with the architecture in terms of how the gateway checks either the asset is locked or locks the asset itself? I think initially we said that the gateway took control of the asset and did the lock itself anyway. So it answers that question as to whether or not the bank has sort of pseudo locked something and hasn't actually done the lock, or did we change that? My apologies again for not knowing the answer.
It's still the same, that the same model that the gateway and gateway operator is responsible for making signing an assertion to the effect that the asset has been disabled. Remember, I used to use the word disabled, but that got confusing. Has been locked in the origin network, right? And how that is proven between the network and the gateway and so on is out of scope. I mean, it can't be in scope. It's just so many options, right?
Yeah, and thank you for clarifying that. I do appreciate that. So Anthony, does that sort of part answer your question in that at the moment we assume that there's a legal relationship between the gateways to say that, you know, it's not fraudulently sending out a message that something is disabled. But future iterations, we might want to look at how the gateway confirms that disablement has happened in a way that is absolute, shall we say. Does that answer your question?
Look, I understand that the reason I raised the issue is because it was clear in the documentation that the gateway takes responsibility for the asset. And my point is, I don't think that's a good idea. So, that's the representation I'm making. Because, I mean, if you take, for example, things like Swift, I mean, Swift is the messaging layer for obviously very large amounts of money on an ongoing basis. It doesn't take responsibility for the amounts of money. It can't possibly. Those responsibilities for updating ledgers lay with the banks themselves. And it kind of is a bit similar to a Swift transaction.
It's not. This is beyond a Swift transaction. Part of what we have to do before the working group was able to be authorized was to prove that there isn't something out there that already answers this problem.
Okay, I understand that.
This might even use Swift messaging as the way that gateways message each other in the future, but that particular element is it's not quite robust enough for what we're trying to do here. Yeah. I appreciate the reference. Thank you.
Yeah. So the proposition I'm making is that it shouldn't be mandatory for the gateway to hold the asset, but it should be that it can pass an assertion that somebody else is holding the asset, and that in that case it's not legally liable. It's the recipient of that assertion needs to make their own decision as to whether or not they choose, and the legal liability would lie from the identity that made the assertion. So that's the proposition I'm making, and I think it's well understood amongst the group.
It seems to me at this point that we're all basically saying the same thing in slightly different ways, right? I don't think anybody has because we cannot impose technical implementations on gateways. How they have locked, disabled, taken control of, are actually the owner of now, right? All of those functionally amount to the gateway, when it's starting a transaction with another gateway, has made the essential assertion that I'm in control of it now, right? That's control being one of the words that's being thrown around. Whether it's in control by legal agreements behind it with the actual owner of it, whether it's actually taken ownership of it, and the inside the network, the original owner trusts the gateway to do so. If not, they wouldn't have started the transaction. I will say that I'm not sure that Swift is actually the right analogy either, because Swift itself is a network acting with all the gateways in coordination of itself, right? And no, you can't sue Swift, but to some extent, Swift is more like a single network where the asset holders, each of the banks in the Swift network are actually the asset holders, and they trust the singular network. This is a different case because we're trying to actually connect different networks. Like, you could see Swift having a set gateway allowing stuff to be transferred to a completely different system. Maybe my analogy's off there.
Absolutely. I think that's a huge use case. In that case, I think if you were speaking with Swift, they would say, we would never actually control or hold an asset. They would just want to be the gateway function, and then have their members take roles to secure or lock or control assets. That's precisely the that's a good use case. I mean, and you'll know, for example, I don't know if you do know, that Swift is involved in an experiment now in the US called the US RSN, where they're taking a gateway function. And I'd love this group to, basically bring to their attention that this is the way to be doing it. It'd be fantastic.
All right, thanks, Anthony. So let's let Martin talk, and then I'm going to pose a question to the group if I can figure out how to form it.
Thanks. There's just a very brief point on that one. So I think that analogy makes sense in terms of Swift being the network, and to Anthony's point, the gateways would be analogous to Swift gateways. So in those cases, it would be the members operating the gateways, and the members, the gateways, which means it's fine for those gateways to be in control, because the signatures that are coming out of those gateways are member signatures who are responsible for it, rather than the network signatures. There's not, Swift gateways are always lead back to liability from whoever's operating them. That was it.
Thanks very much, Martin. I appreciate it. So, all right. So I'm trying to figure out how we can get out from under sort of this conversation into a concrete, eventual solution. And my thinking is that we've sort of coalesced around, I think we've coalesced around a notion, right? So really, we're really just talking about terminology. I think that we all agree that a network can provide a gateway that meets its internal needs, and two different networks agree that these two gateways are able to, that we trust them, because there's sort of an underlying agreement behind that perception. So when we are talking in the protocol documentation, in the architecture documentation, about the gateways are blank of an asset, where it seems to me like control is still possibly the right word. They have controlled the asset in a way that's made it disabled from transaction internally. I mean, there's a bunch of other ways that we could phrase that. So I guess my question to the group is, it seems to me like most people believe that control is a reasonable terminology for the document authors to use. We don't use own. That may or may not be true, but is control an unreasonable term? Who thinks that is not the right term for talking about how a gateway is securing an asset for the transfer? Yeah, securing is not the right word. Does anybody disagree with control?
Look, it's not my favorite, but as Claire said, these things evolve, and it's it could be close enough to eventually just being a sort of pure technical function. So I wouldn't object. Okay.
I think that brings us to closure on that. So that is good. So we just spent 43 minutes on one word. That's usually how it goes. So, all right. With that, I think that was a really good discussion. And I think we've brought a lot of conclusion with how people are thinking about things. So thank you for all of that. Thomas, is there anything else on the architecture document? And I guess the other outstanding question is another round of changes that you want to make before we do a last call on it or not?
Just probably the only change from this morning, I posted to the mailing list about using the word control instead of own. So we could just hash that, on the mailing list. It's just one paragraph, so it shouldn't take too long. And probably the only other thing is, if David, if you're happy with Appendix A, with all the the discussion about threats, then we can close that one, and we could do last call. I absolutely agree with the comments you have made on the mailing list about threats, and I think the last comment you made was about the originator user and beneficiary user, agreeing on some kind of a encryption mechanism. That is actually interesting and could be a future work item for the working group. But to answer Wes, I think this last paragraph about containing the word control is probably the only thing we need to fix before moving to last call for the architecture document.
Thanks. That's fantastic to hear. Rama?
Sorry, real quick. Do you want to? Does it make any sense to add control subject to the constraints of the network, or do you think control by itself is enough?
Yep, we could do that. Let's put it to the mailing list, so that I have in the paragraph I could just cut and paste.
Okay.
I've got one last suggestion actually on this. If you use the phrase demonstrate control, that's as opposed to just control, demonstrate control.
How do you demonstrate the control?
Well, in a number of ways. You could actually control it yourself. You could hold it, or you have to be able to say to the other side, this asset is now locked. So I'm demonstrating control of the asset.
So demonstrate. The reason I'm pushing back, and that's really up to the working group. I'm just trying to narrate the discussion, but demonstrate implies the ability to prove it. And
yes, exactly.
And I don't think that there is any technical way to prove that.
Oh, prove control. Well, I mean, if for example, you could prove control. Let's say let's say the gateway does have its own address, and it's transferred to that address. That would be the ownership model. So this is the gateway actually holding the asset. And you would demonstrate control by, if it were a public blockchain, saying, look, it's now at this address. Here's the transaction that took it to that address. Or for a private blockchain, you could do a local proof of some kind.
That does depend on the technology underlying. You're right.
Exactly.
Alessandro,
it's broad enough.
what?
It's broad enough.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I appreciate the suggestion, but I think that would open a whole other discussion about proving that control. Yeah. So you could prove it in a number of ways, yes, but I think proving that control would be definitely out of scope for SATP. So I don't think it's worth it for us to go into that discussion at this point.
Okay.
All right. Well, we need to move the meeting along. I think that we're at a good point. As another reminder that I probably should have put on one of the introductory slides, nothing is decided concretely in verbal meetings like this. Everything is done on the mailing list, and so Thomas has already written up some stuff about the usage of the word control. So we'll let that be the marker. But to me, if the way the chairs are supposed to read consensus is understanding the opinions on the mailing list, and we'll take that into account. But it sounds like the general consensus, at least in this meeting, is that the use of the word control is sufficient, even though it's not perfect. So thank you for that. With that, Thomas, we only have about 10 minutes left, but would you like to shift into anything you want to bring up today? Maybe one small topic about the core document.
So I was just going to ask if the chairs, if we could create an editors subgroup for core, just the way other working groups, say, okay, and the purpose is to go through some of the issues that are posted on GitHub, right? So, for example, I think there's 6 or 7 pull requests, and I think part of this, editor subgroup would be just to go through each of these, issues and decide, is this good? Is this bad? Does it actually, changing sentences, does it actually make fundamental changes, to the whole protocol? But is that, is that possible, Wes? Is that desirable?
So that is a great question, and the right way to answer that is yes and no. So a couple of things. When changes are being made that are editorial, anybody that is a document editor, we mix use of the word editor and author all the time in the IETF, but as a reminder, the IETF documents that are going forward and progressing through a working group are not in control, of the editors entirely, right? I've had documents that I was the editor for, and the working group made a decision that I, thought was wrong, but the consensus of the decision still meant that I had to apply that change to the document. So we trust the editors to make sure that they're not putting in changes that are not reflected by the consensus of the working group. So as the editors of the document, if you feel like a pull request is, agreed to by, generally agreed to, especially when they're editorial changes, then you can just go ahead and approve it as the editor. That's your job. If the editors need to talk together to, to come to agreement that, hey, yeah, we really do believe that all of this is in consensus, great. If anybody believes that the editors have made changes to the document that are not in consensus, bring it up on the mailing list. It's Claire and my job to address, issues surrounding disbelief in consensus was actually happened or not. When there seems to be something of a sticky point of, well, we're not really sure if there's consensus or not, then poke the chairs, and the chairs will have to review everything. And that's sort of one of our primary roles, is to declare that this decision, where consensus lies and whether there was consensus to make a change or not. So hopefully that answers your question. But you shouldn't need a subgroup. The editors are welcome to talk amongst themselves to make decisions, but whether or not a change is accepted needs to really be happen, in the mailing list or in the discussion in a GitHub thread.
Okay, good. Thanks, Wes.
Wes, for my clarity, pull requests to the core documents, they shouldn't be made until there's been wider discussion. Am I correct?
Yeah.
New topic, just to check the process in IETF.
No, it's a very good question. And so this is actually something we talked about in the very beginning of the creation of the working group, but working groups have the discretion among ourselves to figure out where we want to sort of conduct discussions. There's a couple of things we can do. One, we can allow decisions to be made within pull requests or within issue tickets and things like that, or we can sort of mandate that everything happen on the mailing list. I would argue that we've already started down the line of some discussions happen on the working group trackers. One thing that we can do is I can turn on, I have to go find the instructions on how to do it, but there's actually a tool that will do summary posts to the mailing list about things that have changed in issues or in pull requests, so that there's sort of the mailing list gets notifications about what's happening on the GitHub side of things. But to answer your question more directly, Claire, people making pull requests and editors should really make sure that when a discussion is happening over there, that somebody send a note to the mailing list saying, we are in the process of discussing this here, and it looks like we're coming to resolution to accept this or whatever, so that we make sure that everybody gets notified that there's a change that's being proposed and made. Good question.
Thanks. I think Wes, maybe my bad also. So the discussions typically occur through issues, right? So like anyone can post an issue, but the editors are really the ones that really need to do the pull requests and accept changes.
Well, anybody can comment on a pull request, and I believe, but the editors are the only ones that can merge it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry about that. I submitted a pull request. I just thought it was a good way of kind of like...
No. That's actually Absolutely. Anybody is welcome to make pull requests. Just recognize that whether it gets accepted or not depends on the consensus of the entire working group.
All right.
Alexander?
Yeah, just conscious of the time. So I think it would be good to discuss the rest of the proposals in the pull request that Anthony raised. I don't know if it has to be like another interim meeting, but it would be good to have a follow-up call. Maybe Thomas and whoever else wants to join, so we can go through each of those steps, because we had a 40-minute discussion on one word here, but on that pull request there are a lot of other words that are changed, and we would like to get this resolved sooner rather than later.
Yeah, agreed. I was gonna.
Sorry, if you
Go
like,
ahead,
I can summarize what was in the pull request and put it on the mailing list.
So why don't we do that for the time being? But I do think that another interim meeting would be good. Please don't hold, wide Zoom meetings and things like that. That's where we get into trouble. There's a whole IETF process about doing that. In fact, I even consulted with the IETF lawyers about the right way to do design groups and stuff. So my guess is that we can't do it too close to the IETF. And I believe that the next probably easiest day to do it would be June 18th. And if we had another meeting, which is, in 3 or 4 weeks, if I'm not counting. So June 18th is a Tuesday, if this time slot works for everybody. This has been our traditional time slot. And if that sounds good, the chairs can put together a interim meeting request. And obviously on the agenda would then be to discuss the changes to the core document is the primary starting agenda. Anybody object to that or think that's the wrong approach?
I think that makes a lot of sense. And if we can get a summary out to the working group in the meantime, that gives people a chance to digest and have an opinion.
Excellent. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. It would be good that people come prepared before the next interim meeting on the topics that we will discuss.
Yeah, we would certainly look to the editors of the document to summarize ahead of time the reading materials needed to really understand the discussion that's going to happen. That would be very, very helpful. So. All right, conscious of time, so why don't we do that? Any last minute short discussions today? And yes, Thomas, please do, or anybody that might have made a pull request or anybody that wants to, please do send a note to the mailing list about discussions that are active on GitHub that really should be looked at soon.
Okay, will do. Thank you, Wes. Thank you, Claire.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. I think we will go ahead and call this adjourned since we're just short of the hour by minutes. And I should get to the other 2 meetings I'm in conflict with. So appreciate it all. And Claire and I will set up another meeting on the 18th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.